Welcome everyone to Growth from Home. I'm your moderator for today's panel, Rosie Matteo. I'm founder of Matteo Communications. We're a leading strategic communications agency focused on cannabis. And today's topic is cannabis coverage fair or biased? And we're joined today by three of the top reporters in the cannabis industry, who I feel very lucky to work with day in and day out. We have Natalie Fertig, federal cannabis policy reporter at Politico. We have senior reporter, Business Insider, Jeremy Burke, who covers the cannabis industry for the publication, and Javier Hazy, the managing director of Benzinga Cannabis. Thank you guys so much for being here today. I want to jump right into it. Jeremy, Natalie, and Javier, you guys have all been covering the cannabis beat for a while now, some since the start of the legal industry. How would you guys compare the coverage in mainstream media today compared to when legalization movement started around a decade ago? Any of you can jump in and start. Maybe Jeremy.
Sure. So, yeah, it's an interesting question. I'd say the dominant trend that I see is one of professionalization. I think, even 4 to 6 years ago, it was the pot pun headlines that, everyone, myself included, hated. I think now, publications take it much more seriously as a sector worthy of coverage. To Natalie's job at Politico, I mean, they have built out a whole cannabis team, which is a big move, and similarly to BI. So these are major mainstream publications that are taking the industry very seriously. So I'd leave it at that. I mean, I think professionalization, especially on the part of the media, has been the dominant force.
Natalie.
I mean, I think what Jeremy said is exactly true. Politico would not employ 3 people to cover cannabis if there was not a cannabis industry to consume the information and politicians who are considering this issue, either from an industry perspective or a criminal justice perspective. And that did not exist 10 years ago. It didn't really even exist 2 years ago in the same way it does now. So
yeah, no, definitely agree with both of you. One thing that Jeremy touched on is one of my favorite topics, around puns. And I remember 2014 writing an article on smoking hot cannabis stocks and buzzworthy derivative plays. And I was like, damn, like how many puns can you fit into a headline? And of course, all of that has vanished from in coverage written by people who focus on the cannabis industry, not so much from mainstream reporters, writing one-off stories. The other thing I noticed is, the amount of news. You asked about the industry, right? We've had a lot of news about the movement, about the community, about the plant, about science before the industry, but you asked about the industry, right? And, for instance, at Benzinga, we started putting out maybe 10 articles on cannabis a week 5 or 6 years ago. Now we put like 400 articles a month, right? Because there's so much news. It's not like we're making it up, right? So a lot of things are really going on in the industry. And I think that's interesting because it allows you to be a reporter, right? Some of us are just like part news reporters. Other people are investigative, but for me, I'm a hard news guy, so it's easier not having to scramble for actual news items that are newsworthy.
Our Politico newsletters are just the kind of rule of thumb is they're about 1,200 words. And when our team started, they were like, we know, like, we're launching this kind of ahead of when cannabis really ramps up policy-wise. If you guys don't hit 1,200 words every day, like, it's okay. We've never hit 1,200 words. As in, we're always at like 1,600, 1,800. And we're like, what do we cut? Like, what do we get out of this newsletter? There's just always...
There's nothing you can cut too. Like, that's the thing. You look at it and you go like, all of this is news. All of this is super important. Yeah. What do I cut? And whatever you decide to cut, someone will be pissed and someone will be happy.
Well, usually we just run it the next day, but like...
That's right. And I think this actually brings me to the next question. So we are seeing many mainstream outlets carve out specific cannabis beats. You guys have all done this for your publications. But as you know, cannabis can be really relevant in so many different sectors: business, technology, healthcare, finance, investing. You guys all cover that. Does it help or hurt to pigeonhole cannabis with their own beats? Or do you think they really should be part of, mainstream, verticals? How do you guys think about it as you guys are carving out, your coverage?
I can start. I've thought about that question a little bit. Since I pitched the beat at BI myself, so I've had to kind of think about how long term of a role this may be, and I think the answer is twofold. I think right now, and for the next couple of years, however long that may be, I think the industry deserves sort of a full-time focus. There's so many quickly moving policies. Information is really fast and fluid. And the number of players that sort of crop up and fizzle out on even a monthly basis is pretty head-spinning. So I think it deserves a focus. That being said, in a decade, if cannabis is legalized in the U.S. and the UN, reforms its treaties and it becomes legal in many countries around the world, this becomes sort of another commodity. So the healthcare aspects may be covered by the pharma reporter. The agricultural aspects may be covered by the agricultural reporter. But that still may leave room for an industry focus, someone who's actually, looking at the earnings of these companies, looking at the policies that people on Capitol Hill are writing and trying to get passed. So I think the answer is twofold there.
I know at Politico there were already a number of reporters from other verticals. We have 17 verticals that were reporting on cannabis. One of our agriculture reporters, Liz Crampton, reports a lot on hemp. She's really been doing a lot of USDA reporting. We've had banking. The banking team was following the cannabis banking bill. There's just been different people that were focusing on different aspects of it. And some of them still will take point on stuff. We never cover the New Jersey vote because we have an entire New Jersey team that just rocks that coverage area. And so I kind of agree with Jeremy, 10 years from now, will Politico still have a dedicated specific cannabis team? I think that if the market's there for it, it will, but I could also definitely see a scenario where it just gets morphed back into some of the other teams like agriculture, like pharma. And we have a person who covers drugs. So she was doing a lot of cannabis coverage before, this became. So she would cover the medicinal, anything that's approved as an FDA approved drug that comes from the cannabis plant. She would then, take back over that. But,
yeah. The only thing I would add is it really depends on each media outlet's, desire to have a focused team, right? Some media outlets have generalists, right? People who can report on anything and everything. And many others have very specialized teams. So it really depends on what you're trying to achieve as a media outlet, I think, given the complexities of the cannabis industry and space, which I don't foresee, disappearing even in a decade because of the many, different, as you said, industries and subsectors and different aspects to the space and its, implications for legality or illegality. Right, there's always space for dedicated reporting. So, there's no one answer, right? It'll be up to each one of us to decide, how much of a focus we want to put in it. Of course, if you have a dedicated reporter, the reporting will be more concise. Will be sometimes, the facts will be, better, or the knowledge of the industry will show.
Yeah.
That's it.
Well, that's the thing is an agriculture reporter is going to have a more broad look than someone who covers the corn industry.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so there's always going to be that. I know that we created a team now at Politico because of the crazy state versus federal politics scenario. And that's very kind of about this time period. And there's so much going on that it was none of the other reporters could keep track of everything happening in cannabis, even if it was related to their beats. So
one of the things I see is a lot of collaboration, and this is starting to really, take off. And I, for instance, am not an expert on North American policy and politics. I know enough to do a decent story, but if I wanted to write a great story, I would, go find a reporter who's focused on cannabis policy or politics versus business or finance like I am, and collaborate on a piece. So I see a lot of that as well. Maybe you have a dedicated cannabis team, but as time goes by, your healthcare team is, more acquainted with the cannabis space and can collaborate on pieces, say with Natalie or Jeremy. I see him collaborate sometimes on pieces with, people who are more into venture capital or tech, right? And it really adds value. And I do it a lot, and I notice whenever I do it with someone, the result is so much better, right? Whether it's, even if it's culture, right? For instance, I don't know trap as well as I know rap. So I interview some rapper from Texas or a trapper from Latin America, and I find someone to collaborate so that they can put into words all these things that we've uncovered throughout an interview, for instance.
And just one point to touch on that Natalie said, I think it's about what the market demands, right? A lot of media companies have thin budgets, and paying reporters to do good work is expensive. So it's about, what can they show that the market wants, and how can they sort of meet that demand? And that demand, as we all know, changes a lot, and it becomes hard to predict. So.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that. So talking about demand and beat and, bandwidth. So, we're talking now in October around, 7 months into the beginning of the pandemic. And I know in the beginning of this, a lot of the cannabis reporters, I know you specifically, Jeremy, you were pulled off the cannabis beat to cover the pandemic, or, some of the reporters were furloughed during this. Like, how did the disruption affect your and your colleagues' workflow? And are there conversations within your newsrooms about increasing cannabis coverage now that in more of this like post-COVID, now the cannabis has been deemed essential? Talk to us about like being pulled off and like the missed stories because, everybody was, focused on the COVID news. I'd love to hear about what the newsrooms were like during, those early days of the lockdowns.
Yeah, so I mean, it's hard to get a full picture of what the newsroom was like because we were all sitting in our own apartments, to be honest. So
I guess your virtual newsroom, right?
Yeah, I mean, right. But the point being is that the general buzz and conversation we certainly lack without being in the newsroom in general. That being said, for myself, I live in New York City, and in March that was the height of the pandemic. March, I guess, into early April. And to me, I mean, not to sound like I'm the most altruistic, but it felt like kind of reporting on this was something I could do to help. I'm obviously not a doctor or a nurse, but I can intake information and, regurgitate it pretty efficiently. So I figured that was just a good way to feel like I'm not sitting twiddling my thumbs. And there were some angles there for us. Like we published a story in early April about the cannabis industry and COVID and how, the economic or I guess at that time, impending economic recession was sort of hurting cannabis companies who were short on cash until, it was deemed an essential business, which gave them all a boost. So there's a lot of stories left on the table. That being said, there's not stories I feel like I missed so much because attention, I think, outside of COVID was spread really, really thin, particularly in New York at the height of the pandemic. That's not to say people wouldn't have read my stories, but I think there was sort of a broader use case for shifting some reporters' energies, especially, because, like what I was doing wasn't rocket science, right? I was covering Cuomo's response, and I was covering, basically what doctors are saying in hospitals. So it didn't take a deep body of knowledge to really sort of dive in and take those phone calls and sit on those press calls and watch press conferences. So, it felt like it was just doing something that we could do to help. It was kind of an all hands on deck situation, at least in the BI newsroom for a short period of time there.
Yeah, and I think some of like the bright spots that came out of that time period was that cannabis is deemed essential in those early days. So I'd love to know what the conversations and newsrooms are like now. Now that it has been deemed essential, like has it changed in the way you guys are thinking about covering it coming into the election? And just time period, I think has been very interesting, for cannabis as a whole. I'd love to hear sort of how you guys are thinking about it. Yeah. Or like, or I guess more about it's gonna be a very salient issue in this election year. So as you said, like finding that path to economic recovery, like what stories or themes within the industry you're excited about to cover, coming out of like COVID as it being an essential industry and coming into the election? What's really exciting you right now?
I mean, from a politics standpoint, coronavirus both like derailed an enormous number of state initiatives. I mean, we have 5 states that are voting on it in 2 weeks. Like saying that makes me like a little
I'm very nervous for you right now.
But I don't, on November 3rd, but there are so many other states that are like coming through the pipeline, and because of the budget shortfalls in a lot of states, they're starting to talk about cannabis as a budget. I think when you look at statistically, like states that have legalized, it's not actually that much of their state budgets, but it's still becoming a really, really common selling point. I mean, I know that New York State is going to probably legalize, well, if they can get legislation passed. I assume that they're going to be soon. New Jersey's supposed to legalize on November 3rd. Like the polling is very high for that. And so that's, a lot of people are assuming it's going to start this domino effect through the Northeast. Like this is, we've been looking at, we just had a team meeting being like, should we think about what happens after November 3rd? And I mean, for Politico, election night every 4 years is like our Super Bowl and our Olympics combined. So we're like, does anything happen after that? But I mean, we're kind of realizing that like we might get a breath, but it's just going to be gung-ho after this. And to your point of how did COVID change newsrooms, our team, our 3-person team was like working 16 to 18-hour days as all these states were deciding what they were going to do with policy regarding are cannabis stores going to close, they're going to stay open. So we were not pulled off. But a lot of our state reporters that we work really closely with were pulled into state level health reporting. And so we were then working overtime to make up for the loss of like some of our great California and New York and Florida cannabis reporters who do like cannabis and health. But they're all coming back now. So we're starting to get more collaboration with them. They're, not that, I mean, obviously the pandemic hasn't stopped, but in terms of reporting, there's become more of a cycle. It's not just like a fire hose all of the time. So they're coming back, and that makes it a lot easier for us to be able to do more great reporting with them. I know that our vertical did really well when we launched in the first year, and there had been whisperings of maybe hiring more people. And those whispers, I don't hear them anymore, but that's just a recession, unfortunately. So.
I mean, my perspective is very different, just because the sort of business and newsroom that we have at Benzinga for cannabis is quite different. We didn't cut any of our reporting. We hired a bunch of people actually for cannabis initiatives, both reporting and other initiatives throughout the pandemic. We also launched a Spanish language news site, El Planteo, also focused on cannabis, and it's another 9 people there. So, I mean, it was quite special. I understand it was a unique situation, and I am super grateful, honestly. That said, I don't want to gloat, right? So that's it. Going back to all the COVID impact on policy and politics and all that, what I can bring is maybe an international perspective. So far, we've seen a lot of discussions in the U.S. over the past few years, on taxation, on job creation, on of course, things like muni bonds and very diverse implications of legalizing cannabis. And what we're seeing is a lot of that kind of filter to the international realm. So now we're seeing many governments looking at the U.S., Canada, Uruguay, and Colombia, and seeking for kind of experiences to take from them to regulate their own markets, and a lot of them are coming out overtly or not so overtly saying, this is clearly one of our biggest bets for economic recovery post-COVID. And that is interesting. And one of the most interesting things I've seen in that sense was when cannabis was deemed essential in the U.S., that also kind of percolated to the whole world. And in Latin America, it caught on really strongly, not because we have legal cannabis and it was deemed essential, but because people started their own hashtag, Cannabis Esencial, so essential cannabis, highlighting the need, how essential cannabis is and how, in a context of COVID, accessing illicit cannabis products is harder than ever before. And there's a whole campaign around the need for self-cultivation or home growing down here because it's such an essential product that cannot be procured in pharmacies, right? So a lot of, the same way that in the 30s prohibition kind of emanated from the US and kind of, caught on in the rest of the world like a contagious thing. The same thing now. We look up north and say, oh wow, it's essential. It's big business. It's tax revenue. It's jobs, and it's a lot more than just weed. It's the cannabinoid extraction process. It's hemp and hemp for textiles and hemp for hempcrete and of course pharmaceutical products and then phytopharmaceutical products, right? And it's crazy. I've been getting a lot of calls from Latin American government officials going like, hey, what do you know about hemp? Right? Because they had they had forgotten what they knew about hemp. It's not like we didn't grow it here, by the way. It's not like we don't know how to grow it. We just stopped. We all know why. But it's an interesting time. It's an interesting time, and people are understanding from many different angles why cannabis needs to be illegal. It's economically, it makes sense, and in terms of social justice, it makes sense, and in terms of fairness and healthcare, it makes sense.
Yeah, and I think you break up a lot of topics there. Then maybe the mainstream readers don't really know about the industry that you guys are exploring through your coverage. What is the one fundamental fact or idea that you think the average mainstream reader should know about the industry based on everything that's happened, in your experience in the space and where things are going to be going, hopefully, post this election?
I can start with that. It's pretty simple. I think it's how difficult it really is to run one of these businesses. I think a lot, especially of our readers, I guess I could speak to that more expertly, but a lot of our readers, are generally people that, work maybe in finance, tech, or media. They think like, oh, it's a drug, it can sell itself. But then when you really peer into the regulations and how many fires as an operator you have to put out constantly, a lot of those things really, really eat into your revenue. So it's really, really hard to run a profitable cannabis business. And that will change, as regulations get ironed out, but it's a lot harder than people think. And that leads to a lot of downstream effects. I mean, just to the point of the idea of cannabis legalization sort of paving over budget deficits in states. I mean, there's a lot of things that need to be ironed out, like 280E, which is a section of the IRS tax code that doesn't allow cannabis businesses to deduct expenses. So that, as long as that exists, the profits that I think state legislators see coming in won't be there. And that's something that only the federal government can fix. So all that is to say, it's Byzantine to run a cannabis business. And you really have to know what you're doing. It takes a full-time professional focus. It's not as easy as getting a bunch of people to roll up joints and selling them for $10 a pop or whatever you may.
Adding to Jeremy's point, a lot of people often ask me, what should I do in cannabis? How can I grow cannabis? Like, I have $500,000. I want to invest in Uruguay. I want to invest in Colombia. And when, the capital exuberance, as Jeremy calls it, period kind of, was flourishing and everyone was happy and flush. People were investing millions and they were just developing growth that wouldn't be profitable and are still not profitable, after years. And everyone thought like, yeah, we'll go grow cannabis in Colombia or in California or wherever. It's going to be a blast. It is not. But guess what? You can do other stuff, right? We're in an era of a capital crunch where there's not as much available capital. And in fact, there's 70% less available capital this year than there was last year, basically. So suddenly all these capital intensive ventures no longer make sense for many people, starting to grow from scratch right now. It's like, well, where will you get like $12 million? But you can do many other things in cannabis, right? I started a business on my own with $5,000. So it's not like you just got to get creative and then think, well, what can I do beyond growing cannabis? What can I, apply my current knowledge to, in the cannabis space? But that maybe we'll see, I think, a shift there in terms of investor interest in other verticals and entrepreneurial interest in other verticals that are not just growing, right? Because it's become so complex, so expensive, and kind of crowded, and a race to the bottom. And all this is not to say don't grow cannabis if you think you can do it, because we need it, right? If no one is growing cannabis because everyone wants a more profitable business, we have no industry. We have no medicine, we have no patients, we have nothing. But, just, think about it long and hard before you make a decision to go, well, I'm going to grow, or I'm going to transport cannabis, or I'm going to touch the plant, because it's, Jeremy says, those compliance hurdles and general complexities will not disappear overnight.
Mm-hmm. Natalie?
Well, I would say, it's small farming. We all know the, dying American farms narrative, so it's not a whole lot different. The thing that was coming to my mind isn't completely industry related, but I think that something that I've found in my reporting is just how little people know about the links between cannabis enforcement and both policing and criminal justice. I think that people think, oh, just this kind of base, and we use this statistic a lot about, there's 660,000 people arrested last year for cannabis, and, Black people are 4 times more likely than white people to be arrested for cannabis, but it extends so much further beyond arrests for cannabis possession or, simple cannabis sales. There's, civil asset forfeiture that is massively linked to cannabis policy. There are mandatory minimums that have incredible implications when you're caught with cannabis. I was talking to someone recently about, they tweeted about flying with cannabis, and I was like, I DM'd them and I was like, hey, you just like admitted on Twitter to like a felony, and he was like, but it's not that big of a deal. And I was like, actually, you could, if they decide to sue you, it's like drug trafficking charges, which have like 5 to 10 year mandatory minimums, even though you have, there's just like a lot of people look at cannabis as this funny thing. And then we think, oh yeah, people who are arrested for like minor possession, but there's so many more implications. I mean, just getting into police tactics, like no-knock warrants are directly related to the war on drugs. And that's what was used. At least police had a no-knock warrant in their possession when they went into Breonna Taylor's house. So there's just so many more, I guess, implications of cannabis. And I think as a reporter, I get that cannabis can kind of be funny. Like I walk into a party and people go, oh, you're a reporter, what do you cover? Cannabis. And like I'm immediately the funniest person in the room. And then I disappoint them all by talking about like banking or something. But it is a really serious issue for a lot of people, and it has really serious implications even further than just I was arrested for cannabis possession. It has filtered into our law enforcement system in very dramatic ways.
Yeah, and everywhere around the world, I've faced the front barrel of a policeman's gun many more times than I should have over like a joint. Literally, like 2 or 3 policemen pointing guns on you over a joint. And then my friends ask me, like every time I go to the US, which used to be like once a month, and they ask me like, hey, bring back some gummies. And I'm like, dude, I'm like, you Google me and all you see is me surrounded by weed plants, me on weed roads. Like I am not taking anything on that plane. It's like, but no one will catch you with gummies. It's like, they might,
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting point. So, you get to cover it, a bit, Natalie. And how do you guys, I know you guys all took a leap to get your editors or, to get your publication to really cover the space. How do you guys go about, and I know like some of like an acquisition or a big business story sometimes is better like clickbait. Like how do you leverage your positions to get those stories told? And, how do you the title of this panel is, is cannabis coverage fair or bias? Like, how do you get to cover, what you might think, is important versus, what's clickable? Like, how does that happen in the newsroom? I think people really want to understand because some of those stories aren't being told. Like even you're saying, the no knock, enforcement. Talk to me about like how that happens.
I mean, it's hard, because journalism, not a lot of people go into journalism because they're, kind of altruistic and they want to speak for people who can't speak for themselves. But you still you have to get paid too. And so there's this kind of back and forth all the time between we would love to investigative departments in newspapers do not pay for the newspaper. They make a difference in the world, but they do not pay for the bottom line of the newspaper. It's like the sports section, that pays for the bottom line of the newspaper. And even in Politico, we have similar things where we're reporting for the industry, and at Politico we report on power, and so there's been a lot of good but hard conversations, especially in the last 6 months, I think, about a lot of the people that are impacted by these things don't have power, and if our mandate is to report on the workings of power and they don't have power, where do they fit into our reporting plan? And I think that we're still solving that problem. I think that it's been really good that I was glad that my newsroom has been having the conversation. I don't think that we're perfect or that we have all of the solutions yet. There's definitely been stories that I've wanted to do that, fell by the wayside because they would have taken a lot of time and a lot of manpower and a lot of investigative resources that is just not within my job description right now as a policy reporter. I mean, there's a lot of day-to-day stuff that I have to do for our readers who come to us to know what's happening day to day on Capitol Hill. So sometimes those stories you kind of have to squeeze the reporting in amongst all of the other things, like pouring water into a jar of marbles or something. Like, you figure out where it can come from when you have time. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely an imperfect process, but I think there's always stories that you want to tell that get lost. That's just part of journalism. You just never have the time to do them all. And I'm the first person to beat myself up over all of the stories that I don't do, or that, you know, Jeremy beats me to, that I pitched last week and we didn't have time, or, you know.
It sucks. It sucks. Sometimes, like, a lot of people reach out, right? And every story is worth telling, and you know, in some measure, right? Especially when people are suffering, when they need cannabis, when they ask you to help them with advocacy, and you can only help so many people. And you know, it does keep me up at night, like, a lot. You know, I get like Twitter messages, and it's like, please help me get this out. And it's like, okay, let me see where I can fit it in. But, you know, back to your question, I think, and I may be wrong, so please correct me, but I think, like, all three of us, like 3 reporters here, are lucky enough to work for media companies that are not particularly click driven, right? It's not like, we don't have editors usually hounding, you know, breathing down our necks, like, how many clicks you know, that this gets, right? Is it valuable? Is it good reporting? Will it help advance the brand, right? Because there's many more ways nowadays to monetize traffic than just clicks, right? So if you're smart, you don't live and die for a click. You build a good brand, and people come to you for other reasons. And I think you see this at Politico with subscriptions, at Business Insider with subscriptions, at Benzinga. They come to us for events and you know, like, financial services, because they know the brand. No one asks me, like, how many clicks did you get? You know, they want to see consistency in the reporting today, tomorrow, and no matter how profitable or not the actual article is. And as Natalie said, you know, editorial departments usually lose money. You know, there's, unless, I don't know, like, what kind of secret there is, but usually you just lose money, right? From producing articles and make up for it and with other business.
Oh, I mean, I feel like more investigative departments may lose more money. I would say that if an editorial department as a whole is losing money, it may not be doing a very good job in terms of its business model. But yeah, I mean, essentially, the subscription model helps a lot.
I think for us, at least for me in particular, it's about knowing your reader. BI, you know, for its part, you can love it or hate it, but we're extremely data driven. You know, a lot of things we do, it's not necessarily clicks, but everything we do is quantified and analyzed based on how it performs in some ways, like whatever metric that may be, whether it's subscriptions or clicks. That being said, it's, you know, if you have a window into your data, into your reader, if you have that data, for me, it allows me to show, like, okay, I know, you know, topic X, let's say, whatever it may be, gets subscriptions. Like, people come to us for that coverage. So I can kind of, when I get pitches or I get tips, I can kind of target my coverage. Let's say, you know what, I think this is going to work. And I can make the case, you know, quantifiable case to my editor that this is a story worth, you know, lending, you know, 10, 15 hours of my week into. So it's just about knowing your audience. I mean, you know, like, hopefully we're reaching the right readers, people interested in the industry or people within the industry. So they may want to read something, you know, that's very different from what a Benzinga or a Politico reader may want. So it's about knowing your readers and finding your niche, and you know, making sure that your interest overlaps with your reader's interest, I would say.
Yeah, and I think, like, that's actually a good question I would like to wrap with this session with. I think a lot of people tuning in, there may be you know, business founders, or maybe even the other, you know, PR people. What is the one tip you can give? You know, Jeremy said, like, a lot of it's data driven, like, you guys know your readers. What's the one tip or a founder or a publicist in the space that you want them to know about, you know, pitching you? Like, what's that one tip you can give them? And also, and how does that lend to, you know, what the future of cannabis journalism is going to look like for you guys, you know, post this election year? If you can give, like, a tip of how people can move forward and, you know, and work with you guys.
I have a good one to start with. It's be human.
You always do. You pop peeves, by the way.
Be human, dude. Like, I can't like stress this enough. be human. Like there's someone on the other side of this computer receiving 800 emails a day from robots and you know, follow-ups. And it's just take the time. Like I'm an actual person, you know, with feelings, with a life, with interest, you know, with like a limited amount of time. And I want to do what's best for the industry, for the community, for the movement, and for everyone involved here. But, you know, so it's just that, be human, like look into what I do, you know, like send an email, hi Javier, not hi dear journalist, right? Like address me. That's all I ask. Like I will always find time if you address me. If you send me a robotic email, it's like, yeah, no, bye. I'm sorry. You know, you can't expect to do zero work, just send out something that's completely non-personalized and receive a personalized response. So that, you know, just one more time, be human.
Is it okay to call you JB, Jeremy, sometimes when I email you?
Yeah. I would just say, I mean, I would say this, the bar, I mean, since we write for subscriptions, the bar is super, super high for turning a pitch into a story. And I would say, you know, 90% of what we write is not generated from pitches. So, you know, we don't spend all day kind of, or at least in an ideal world, we don't spend all day kind of just waiting for pitches in our inbox. Like we have stories we're working on, we're talking to sources all day long, trying to figure out what they're seeing, what they're interested in, you know, what some tips that we think we have the reporting tools to bring to fruition are. So the bar is really, really high. If you want your news covered, I think, you know, it depends on if your company is big enough, we're likely going to cover it. Whether or not if it's quality or not. I mean, if you're working on an acquisition in the $1 billion scale, like there's an angle for us. If it's a few million, probably not. I'm sorry about that. And then B, if there's a clear indication that it matters beyond what the simple company is doing, like just because you have a new product coming out, you know, cool, but that's not really what we do here at BI. You know, it's about what does this mean for the industry? Like, where is this moving investor dollars? Where is this moving the needle on policy? So it's about the broader implications, and it's about just the general size of the news. Like we're a national publication. We have 3 people on our cannabis team, so we're spread thin. And so I would say this: the bar is extremely high if you want a pitch turned into a story. And you know, a lot of our stories are just simply generated from conversations with sources. You know, like the things that we, you know, the 3 of us as reporters are doing all day, every day is just talking on the phone a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that I would wish that every person that was going to pitch me did more was read what I've written in the past. Cause I mean, we all get most of the same PR pitches probably, but like I cover politics. And the number of people that pitch me on a new CBD beverage, like every day, I'm like, I cover politics. And then if I delete that email every day, that means it goes in the other folder and then eventually the junk folder. And then you have a good pitch for me, I'm not going to see it. You know, it's like, I've just been like, nope, CBD beverage, nope. Cause that's not, I mean, if like Canopy gets in with like Pepsi to make a CBD beverage, we'll put that in like our little movers and shakers section, right? Because their business has an impact on policy. Right. But I feel like people don't look at what it is that I'm writing. And so they're not pitching things that are something that I'm going to click on and think is relevant. The other thing that I wish people would not do is pitch me people who don't know anything about something to talk to me about. Because I've gotten so many pitches in the last 3 weeks from cannabis companies saying, do you want to talk to our CEO about the MORE Act? And I'm like, no, I want to talk to Jerry Nadler about the MORE Act. And I actually did yesterday. So I'm sorry, but your CEO doesn't know as much as the guy that wrote the bill. I'm sorry. You know, but I'm like, but I want your CEO to tell me what's going on in your company. Like, I wish all those people that pitch me all the time about some bill on Capitol Hill and talking to me about their CEO, I actually tweeted this last week. I was like, send me how much money you lose because you didn't get, like, because of 280E. Send me that when tax time comes around and I'll write a story. Like, that will be great. You know, kind of anticipating a reporter's needs and sending that to me. And I'm like, yes, awesome. I will talk to your CEO right now.
No, send it to me, not Natalie. Yeah.
No, send it to me. That's my idea.
It's really good though. I really like
kidding.
it. And it's just like adding a little bit to Natalie's point. Not only read like the last thing I've done. So today I got 3 different pitches because I did a Magic Johnson exclusive. And they were like, hey, following up on your Magic Johnson story, we have the CEO of this company that's valued at $1.5 million. I was like, how do you follow up? Like, dude, just scroll down my senior contributor column in Forbes, which you're pitching me for, and see like the interviews were. Like if you look at it right now, it's like Magic Johnson, like Snoop Dogg, Martha Stewart. Like what makes you think that fits in this column, right? Like referencing a random article, pretending you read people is equally useless, right? Just going like, I read your article on CBD. It's like, which one? Like, what are we talking about?
My favorite is when I break news and then within 12 hours, someone pitches me. Like when I broke the news that the MORE Act was coming to a vote, I was putting an email like, did you know the MORE Act is coming to a vote? And I was like, because I know. Yeah. Delete.
I wanted to just chime in on a point Natalie made earlier. Like just a peek behind the curtain, the way we think about stories. Like in Natalie's example, if Canopy Growth inks a deal with PepsiCo, that's obviously huge news. Like you may see that story up on our site, sort of like the rewritten PR out of that. That probably won't be under my byline. It'll probably be under our business news team. What we would be interested in, myself and my editor and Yeji, my colleague on the team, would be like, how did this deal come about? So one angle would be like, was there a specific meeting between the execs at Canopy Growth and at PepsiCo that signed the deal that made this all happen? Can we put readers inside that room? Do we have the reporting muscle to do that? Another one would be, does PepsiCo maybe have a stealth team that's looking at cannabis deals, and who's on that team? What are they looking for? Like, will they sign other deals? What does it mean for the industry?
Well, I want to read the story, by the way. I know it's not real. We're just talking.
Yeah, no,
very exciting.
Right. The point being is that you can find, you can find the news elsewhere. Like as soon as the news is out there, our readers don't have a reason to pay for that story. So we always have to find the angle that's worth paying for. Whether or not that's always a measure of quality, I'm not going to be the judge of that, but it's usually a good measure of quality. Yeah.
And then like jumping on that, my angle would be, what is Pepsi going to start lobbying for cannabis?
Right.
So like if you're sending Jeremy and I the same pitches, you're probably not going to get both of us to write about it, but it's the same event, but 2 separate pitches, if that makes sense. And like, I mean, I didn't intend to come on here and make you guys sound great, but the reason I respond to Matteo, like PR people, is because I always get tailored pitches. They're like, we know you've probably been covering the MORE Act. We have this person, or I know you have been paying attention to wildfires out in California. We have this person, and it's always tailored to what I do. And not all of them work out, but like, I pay attention to those emails. I star those PR people, and I always open their emails when they come to me.
Yeah,
makes you feel really good.
Makes you want to provide feedback.
Well, that's a wrap, everybody. No, kidding. But I do want to wrap up with one final question. So the reason, and we talked about a lot today, I'm glad we touched upon, the puns going away, and what it takes to get a story, placed in one of your publications, and the way you guys think about things. But the topic of this panel was: is cannabis journalism fair or biased? I know I'm sure you guys are going to say it's fair, but I would love to wrap up with that question. Given like all the constraints you guys have, like what is the balance between being biased and fair, and how do you guys think about that as you plan your coverage?
There's always a bias. I mean, there's always a bias. My bias is I love cannabis. I think it should be legal, right? I am biased. It's not like I'm going to ignore bad news. I'm not going to ignore, cannabis related, whatever ailments, if there were any, right? It's reports or studies that show, it's dangerous, say, smoking cannabis while you're pregnant. I can't. But there's a bias in all of my coverage, which is, I have a mission to a certain extent. And there's a bias in everyone. Some are more intentional than others, and some are more malicious than others, right? I don't feel like having a pro cannabis bias will really have deep impacts on coverage. But I don't know, maybe there's other biases, like being extremely anti-cannabis could, generate very biased coverage, as we've seen in the past. And extreme pro-cannabis stances also have generated those same reactions, around illnesses, for instance, and things that people don't always want to talk about, right? Because the narrative has been so negative for so long that right now all we want is good press. And I agree, it would be ideal, but every extreme will always generate a bias that is more dangerous than a journalist bias, which always exists, and media outlet biases, which also exist as well, right? It's like CNN is not the same as Fox News.
Anybody else want to add anything to that?
I mean, I would say that one of the reasons why, and there's a lot of different reasons why people do journalism, and the missions of news organizations are very different. So don't take anything that I'm saying right now as like a commentary on what anybody else is doing. But the point of Politico is to kind of be the paper of record on Capitol Hill. And so if we are biased, that very much undermines the legitimacy of what we're reporting. If we say something's happening, we want everyone, whether they're Republican or Democrat, to believe that it is happening, and not to be able to say, well, but they're pro-cannabis, or, oh, well, they're anti-cannabis. And I have pissed off advocates on both sides of this issue. Sometimes the same day. And it's not fun, but
it's funny. It's not fun. It's a little bit funny.
Not fun. I've had, especially with the MORE Act, that was a tough month. But that's our mission, and that's what we're doing. I don't come from a cannabis reporting background. I come from a politics reporting background. I covered the 2016 election and the 2018 midterms, and then I switched into cannabis. And so for me, a lot of people that I know in the cannabis reporting world do great work, but a lot of them were like, I love cannabis, I want to write about it. And that's awesome. But I think the reason that Politico started our team was that we were like, we need there to be kind of a less, especially with politics, there's a lot of the politics coverage in America on cannabis is very pro-cannabis. And while lawmakers might tweet those articles, our coverage is the one being used in meetings, because we can say this is actually what's happening. We looked into these studies on driving and on teen use, and this is what we came to a conclusion on. And they trust that more. So I guess we're trying to make policy happen in the most best informed way. So I'd kind of love to see another politics news organization that is not pro or anti-cannabis come up. And we're kind of the only main national DC based, I'm the only cannabis reporter that's credentialed on Capitol Hill, that's employed as a cannabis reporter. And I'd like to see more. It would give me a little competition. But I just think
to be your opener, like a dating site profile. It's I am credentialed as a cannabis reporter at Capitol.
I took the I'm a policy reporter off my dating profile, because they always asked what I covered. That was their intro. And then I was like, cannabis. And then that's all they wanted to talk about.
Oh my God, it's all they want to talk about.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just say this to chime in on Natalie's point. I mean, we, objectivity, it's sort of a beauty is in the eye of the beholder situation, right? If you looked at my demographic profile, I'm 28-year-old white male, Canadian, live in Brooklyn. You could probably get a pretty easy sense of my political views. And I'm not going to deny the fact that my bias does creep into my work. That being said, we're encouraged to and trained to report against our own biases. And so that's one of the things, we take a hypothesis and we actively, try and discredit it in our reporting. If the story stands, the story stands on its own merit. Part B of that is, I think I'm not afraid to say that, I don't report on the policy as closely as Natalie does. It touches my reporting, but I'm not in the sort of DC sphere. So, I'm not afraid that my reporting may show that I'm on one side or the other in terms of the legalization fight. That being said, the companies we report on, I obviously do not hold any shares. I'm not invested publicly, so I have no dog in the fight. So you hopefully readers can trust that when I report on companies, I'm reporting extremely objectively, and where my reporting touches on policy. I think if there's a bias, you can choose to disregard it if you want, but the information is very rigorously vetted and rigorously checked. So I think I think cannabis is symptomatic of this larger discussion that newsrooms across the country are having, especially with regards to the Black Lives Matter protests. It's like there is I want to be careful with this, but there is sometimes a right and a wrong, and not acknowledging that fact can undermine credibility in some specific cases, not in all cases, but in some cases.
Yeah, as a reporter, usually people don't care what you think, and I try to explain that, in the nicest of terms to
like, what world do you live in?
It's like that's kind of the thing. Like, they don't really care what you think. Your reporting should be based on facts, not like what I think about this topic, but what knowledgeable sources and documents have made evident, have unearthed around this topic. Right? It doesn't matter if you believe cannabis is this or that. Let's find the facts for it. Unless you're an opinion reporter, right? But it's a whole different beast, which we're not at the time. Maybe we can do some one-off opinion pieces, but most of our reporting is this is what's going on, and this is the research we've done, and this is what we uncovered, through this research. But yeah, I don't know. Just I think there's a fair bias in all of us, but and then there's a very clear line. It's not a fine line. When Jeremy was talking about owning shares of a company you're reporting on, is whether you're disclosing it or not. It's like there's a very clear line. This is not a valid bias. If you're reporting on a company you own shares, it's no longer an opinion. You have an economic interest, a vested interest. And all regulations require you to disclose it, and all ethical, linings or guidelines suggest you stay away from covering them completely.
Yeah, and I would say also that bias doesn't always appear just in like I'm pro-cannabis or I'm anti-cannabis. My family, my dad's a veteran, and my grandfather was a veteran, and I have a lot of veterans in my family, and so that is kind of, in a way, it's a bias in that it has made me focus a lot more on the veterans cannabis research bills on Capitol Hill than I think a lot of other people have. I've just been very interested in them. And I think that if I didn't have that personal experience in my life of having so many veterans around me while I grew up, I probably would have, because it's not really like, it's not the MORE Act, or like the banking bill. So it's not one of the big bills, but I've done a lot of reporting on it because that it's a personal bias in a way, not like pro or against, but that this is my experience and I bring that to the table, and I can't delete that experience from my life.
For sure.
Totally.
Well, guys, as one of the 200 emails in your inbox every day, I really appreciate you guys taking the time to do this panel with us today for growth. It was great chatting with you all, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Thanks, Rosie. Appreciate it.
Bye, guys.